start for apologizing. I said I apologize for my English. I just came back from Mauritius and my English is bad normally, but it's worse now after 2 months of 12 French, English, Italian. So maybe I will be sharing everything like religious beliefs as such and demonstrate. So I'm going to talk about the idea of heritage in Mauritius, in today Mauritius, and how to make a sort of confrontation between the idea of heritage given by the 2003 Mauritian Act that instituted the list of the national heritage monument in Mauritius with the idea of heritage that the archaeologist has had in the recent times after the 1975 with the first archaeological research to the very recent one. And then I'll try to go to the main 3-hour project with the MAC, the Mauritian Archaeology and Cultural Heritage Project, such as Greek, Etaprapasigat, Lemon, and Trianon, trying to evaluate how this idea of archaeology that we are doing in Mauritius fits or not with the notion of heritage and what it is also the outreach of these activities in the contemporary Mauritius. The National Heritage Act of 2003, as I said, it is the first official list of the national monuments in Mauritius, and with the same law, the National Heritage Fund (NHF) was funded and was committed to take care of the national heritage. I'll try, as I said, to make this parallel between the idea of heritage that came from this list of monuments and the idea of the heritage that the archaeologists are making with their work in today in Mauritius. There's a picture mixing, I don't know what happened, but there was a Aprovasigat stairs that means I don't know, I see here, and I don't know why. Okay. These 2 pictures shows clearly the idiosyncrasy in this list of 2003 Act and the Mauritius law, because it shows 2 of these monuments listed. One is the famous steps that lead into the immigration depot that became also very important in the symbolism of the island, because every Indian indentured immigrants had climbed these steps to reach the island. And the other is a bronze copy of the original status of 1878 that is in Blue Penny Museum. This copy is in the Cured Peep Garden and is listed also in the same way as the immigration depot at Eprovasigat. So it shows very well how this list it tries to keep all the memory of the nation without going into differentiation, and without going into the materiality of the things, and trying to keep together all the memory of the country and try to balancing all the social issues that listing a heritage or a monument means in a multicultural country like Mauritius. How the idea of heritage took shapes in Mauritius. During the French period, we can say that there is an idea of heritage. It's still a pioneering colonial phase. So French saw themselves like the one who had made the country. So they are not interested in defining the history, their history. Everything started with the British period after the 1810, when the concept of colonial heritage starts to be defined. And this, of course, the concept was what was happening in the contemporary Europe, but also it started to become an element to differentiate the native, that was not native of course, but they felt themselves a native colonist, the French one, against the new British rulers. So the French white communities start to define themselves like with the use of the idea of their past, their glorious past. So the heritage in the first definition given by the Royal Society of Art and Science and in the Committee in History of Art and Literature, it was a committee that was made in the framework of the Royal Society of Art and Science in 1859, was at that time basically a celebration of ancient families and the pioneers in the Highland. So the society paid homage to the memory of local scientists, to the memory of former members of the society, and they erected funerary monuments to them. It's for that reason that 30% of the two-day national heritage monuments in Mauritius are the tombs of the former member of the Royal Society. And are the tombs without distinguish if the tombs are piece of art or not. So the tomb itself is national heritage, listed exactly as as other big building or big areas that we are going to see in a few minutes. So it's a way to celebrate the fathers of the colony. In the 1889, for the first time, with the Historical Record Committee, there is this idea that it's necessary to introduce preservation policies. Following what happened again in Great Britain, start the idea to have a list of the monuments which had to be protected, and of course this list is completely Western and colonial shaped. There is the idea of the past that is inherited from what is happening in Europe. The list is better shaped in 1938 with the Ancient Monument Preservation Ordinance, the Act 19. And it's very interesting to show what were the protection policies that they applied. So basically they were they decided to fencing, covering and prevent the access to the site. So for preserving the past, the idea is to fence the past, to fence out the past from the contemporary living Mauritius. 32 monuments were listed amongst tombs, as I said, memorials, or public buildings like the governor's house or the fort in Port Louis and so on. There was also military buildings. Memorials could be of many kinds, could be memorials of historical events, like for example the battle in the Vieux-Grand Port between French and English armies, but also could be the memory of the visit of one astronomer to the tomb of another astronomer that is buried in Mauritius. So it's a completely chain of memory, immaterial memory inside this list. In the 1997, the National Heritage Trust Fund Act, perfected with the law in 2003, give the list, the official list of Mauritian heritage. That is the list that I worked and you show in the next slides, for trying to evaluate really what is the two-day perception of the heritage in Mauritius, although through the political view and the view given by the Minister of Culture. This list, it reflects completely the 1938 list. It introduced for the first time really the idea of enhancement or valorization of the heritage, but it introduced without saying what to do for the valorization. There is a big attempt to cover all the social groups, to reach the balance in this social negotiation between the different social groups. So it's clear that there are some sites that are added only to keep the number in the right way, achieving a sort of covering the whole island social complexity. It's characterized by a purely theoretical approach, and there is any inventory, any study of the existing heritage, and there is any definition about the materiality of the monument listed. So there is any distinction between wooden colonial house, stone building, or infrastructure, or whatever. Single tomb are not distinguished by complete cemetery. And also, that is very important, is totally inadequate for the definition of the buffer zone. What is the meaning of protecting a single tomb in a cemetery and the other around? What is the geography of the listing is completely missed in the law. So only monuments, only things that you can touch were listed, no open areas and natural sites. Now in the 2008, with the inscription of the Lemur in the World Heritage List, they started to list the first natural site. For example, in the same year, 2008, the Gorge de la Rivière Noire were listed in the same way. But I want to stay in the 2003 list because it's the official law that was issued at that time. So there is any definition of the materiality on the sites, and and if we go deeply on the list, we can see that the 47% is memorials are represented by memorial stone and cemetery tomb. So things that we wouldn't define like national monument in following the Western criteria, the same Western criteria that the law followed by listing the heritage. There are military sites represented by 17%, 20% colonial urban elements, colonial house, that goes from the aqueduct to the governor house or whatever, and then there are infrastructure and productive sites. You can see the comparison with the 1938 and 44 Act of the Royal Society. It is interesting to note that the distribution of the sites followed the demographic distribution. So the most part of the sites are located in Pont-Louis area and Vacqua, Catrelbon, Pulpit area, so where the most part of the people resides today. So it contours completely the two-day Mauritius, and it doesn't represent the colonial, the French colonial Mauritius in the distribution of sites. This is the main chronology graphic pie where I listed the main chronology of each site that represent for 50% of British monuments. This high percentage is due most of the memorial stone that I spoke before, and the memorial, the tombs, and this strange site that were listed mostly automatically when one member of the Royal Society died and they built up the tomb. We have to say that the memory in this list starts with the 19th century, starts really with the British legacy. What is very important to note is the social representation given by the list. So, despite the attempt of the law to represent all the social groups, so trying to represent things that belong to the Indian, Muslim, indentured group, or the enslaved descendant group, at the end, if we go deeply to in the list, 92% are colonial. Because, of course, when we list, for example, the Wagram Depot is, of course, a colonial infrastructure 4 convicts. The convicts were mostly Indian or people coming from abroad the island, but the structure that they listed is something connected with the colonial infrastructure. We have 6 sites linked with the Indian descendants, 2 sites linked with the slave descendants. But if we go into detail, we can see that for the Indo-Mauritian site, only the Bhagwan Depot and the Pravasi Ghat could be really linked with these social groups. The other are memorial tomb or memorial place, or like the Trianon old labor quarters, so the barracks, that are living here, normally associated with the working class, but also I'll show you at the end of the paper, they didn't represent the indentured labor in their majority, but it represents only an aspect of interaction between the real estate owner and the working force. Same things for the slave descendant side, that we have a monument that celebrates the abolition of slavery and one prison. So, try to summarize, there's this idiosyncratic list that at the end shows a great disassociation between Mauritian people and heritage. This heritage that is fenced out by the today Mauritius, and often when heritage is listed is linked with negative memories, and the reason of listing is clear negative in the today Mauritius. Also, it is a consequence of French Mauritian, a long consequence from French Mauritian series of acts we saw starting from the 1838 and so on, but at the end it doesn't represent well neither the French Mauritian group. For example, there are no real colonial house listed, there are no real white French European heritage represented in this list. But the most important thing to note is there is a completely lack of material and environmental approach in this list. If we shift our attention to another list that could be very incomplete, but I try to define which were the main archaeological projects in the Mauritius Island from 1975 to today. And we try to study this data in the same statistic way. We can see that there is some interesting differences. These are the list of the excavation. I tried also to group the project that, for example, the underwater research that are linked with many different projects, but at the end they belong to the same idea, the same also way to do archaeology. So it's not treasure hunting, but we are not so far from that. The red one are excavation documentation activities, with of course artifact studies. The green one, the environmental archaeology project, and there are others that are only documentation project and surveys on historical monuments. The topographical distribution of this project is, it represents the red pie, it represents better the island. Of course, archaeologists follow the sites, not follow where the people are living now. It's interesting to do a parallel between the typology, the types of sites listed in 2003 Act and the site that archaeologists are taking care now. So there is the introduction of new typology, for example, the natural area and open areas, the shipwrecks, and of course there is any intervention on the memorial stone that is completely, I think that is completely not in the agenda of post-colonial archaeology at the time. It's interesting to note that also the archaeologists are not addressing up to now, we are not addressing up to now to the religious side. But this is linked because if you show in the slide before, all the projects are shared with the NHF or with the AGTF, so the Apravasi Trust Fund or the Le Monde Trust Fund, the two UNESCO sites in the island. And it's completely impossible to work on religious site freely, because for this, the same reason that there is any religious site listed in the 2003 Act, doesn't allow to the archaeology to work on religious site, because listing and working in religious site means move out from this balance that in the mind of the people that work in the Minister of Culture in Mauritius is very important to keep at the 0 point. So it's important to don't go out of this idea of this balance. And of course, religious issues are very, very it's very tricky to go on and to decide what to do. There is, of course, a better representation of the social group. Slave descendant 17%, Indian descendant 22%. Of course, there is still work to do. There is a sort of agenda of colonial archaeology that we can do in Mauritius, and the approaches in red. So, beside the archaeology of indenture, slavery archaeology, or the colonial archaeology of the military past, or the colonial archaeology of sugarcane industry that was not yet very well developed, there is also the classical theme, the themes linked with the colonial French population, the white population that was not yet developed. So the Frenchization, let me use this invented word, so the Britishization of the island. We don't know exactly what happened also in the real states when the political rule changed. How to approach that with an ecological approach, of course, but in the interdisciplinary way, in an Indian Ocean scale, with a social approach, and with a global approach that links the island with the ocean. I'd like to go in detail for a few points in the main excavation that we did as MEC in the last 4 or 5 years. This is a aerial picture from Port Louis, from Faron. It's industrial area and harbor area now, and is the site, the white circle, half Victoria immigration station for buses, half the actual UNESCO site that was the former place for the immigration depot, the indentured laborers arrival area, and the place where immigration office were placed. In red is marked the excavation area for the preliminary excavation that we did together with the GTF Trust Fund before the major work for building the new interpretation center for indentured working system. So a new sort of museum interpretation center that Richard Calaon knows very, very well, that will be open soon, we think in 2 months. It is a perfect colonial research project because we started to work in an environment with a huge quantity of work already done. I mean, on the historical side, archival works, ancient map, so a completely framework already traced and clear. So it's a good example to see how the historical archaeological approach could help the interpretation and also could trace a different agenda in the works. This is the main sequences, but I don't want to go in the detail, only to say you that in this big warehouse today, starting from the most ancient features, we found the side walls of the French dock made by Tromlan in the 1775. So it was the main dock for the Port Louis, for the colonial city, and this is the remains that we found in the excavation. This dock was filled up and transformed in a patent slip, so a port slip for hauling up ships, for repairing ships. This work was done in the middle of 19th century, and it was up to the at the end of the 60s of the 19th century. So this patent slip was in use at the same time with the immigration depot that was absolutely joint. Then the area was converted in a warehouse, before sugar warehouse, and then cold store area. What were the main problems, the given problems that Apravasi-Gat and the historian also asked us to solve? So it was to verify if there was continuity or discontinuity between the indenture system and the slavery. What was the hidden question behind the archaeological excavation? The famous step that the immigrants walked past to enter in the island, that now are a sort of a mythic gate that it represents the indentured labor system and it represents the immigration in India, were used or not also by slaves. Because this possibility that they were also used before, it led an idea that slavery is the indentured labor system is the new slavery. So the use of one symbol, one specific symbol that is also listed as World Heritage Site since 2003 is very important. And of course, linked with this question, our question is what is defined if the material remains from the site represents or not indentured experience. Before answering, we have to say that it was a shared project. A shared project with a lot of outreach activities, with the involvement of a lot of students, local employers as volunteers and so on. I want to say that because this was very important to choose the agenda of the excavation itself. Because we arrived at one moment when we ended the British phase with the question, we go down to search the French phase or not, because it was very risky. Searching the French phase was clear. We knew that the dock was French, the French one made by Tromlan. The ancient maps say that. So excavating that phase, this would be an equation to have French artifacts, but French artifacts are slavery artifacts in some way. So it was quite debated in the site with the workers and also the Apravasi-Gat staff. And so we decided to do that in a specific part near the step. What turned out at the site, of course, looking with the materiality eyes of an archaeologist, is not an Indian or an immigration or indentured site, but is a colonial site. It's a perfect example how the British ruler, the new British ruler, organized people inside a harbor site. So the main archaeological outcomes is the role of the organization of the space in a colonial harbor area driven by the British ruler, and this idea that immigrants were treated on the project of the immigration depot as goods. So the construction, for example, the warehouse for sugar or the link with the patent slip for repairing boats, it belonged to the general idea, to the general master plan of industrial area. And one corner of the industrial area were used as a custom, as immigration depot. If we go to the material, the artifacts that we found, a lot of material and also quite well stratified. We're speaking about more at least 10,000 of fragments of ceramics, and we see a sort of, we go to the interpretation between the provenience, if it's French or British or indenture materials, or material that could be linked strictly with the indenture work, and we see that there is a disproportion, 2%, 98%. What you see in the picture is the 2 fragments of an oil lamp, a Diwali lamp made in India, clay courseware, that probably was carried out in the, with the personal belongings, or was used in the site. So, of course, there is a big representation of what is the colonial meaning of the site. Not only the tableware of the officer, but also all the medical bottle, all the ointment pot, everything that was used in the hospital, because the immigration depot also has an important role as, of course, hospital and hospital environment. Coming back to the famous step, the mythic step of the Pravasi Ghat, a more wide research on the area shows that the steps were very old, were of course on the French time, but I never say that these are also slavery steps. There are simply steps linked with industrial area, also in the French times. You can see in these 4 simplified maps the pathways that the people that disembarking had to do for reaching the actual immigration depot area. And of course everyone had to pass from these steps, but the meaning of these steps, or the mythicization of these steps, it starts only after the middle of the 19th century, and it is reinforced after the 1864 with the enlargement of the Pravasi Ghat. That it is this last draw. Only from that time these steps are linked with immigrants. Before are steps. So the materiality gives us clue to put things in correct list of times. I shift to another archaeological project that Sasha already introduced to you, Le Morne, the cemetery near the Le Morne Plateau. And as Sasha has already said, this Malagasy cemetery was clearly not a maroon cemetery, and the excavation shows very well, because there is the cemetery, for instance, is listed in this late 19th century map with a cross, so people were aware of the presence of the cemetery. But also there are a lot of clues that shows that the cemetery was very visible in the area, and that people who buried their familiars there, they had strong link with the area. You can see here the traces of a nice coffin for a young adult grave that was, of course, built outside in the nearest village and was bought and used in the cemetery. All the graves used nice coffin, wooden coffin. This is the map of the area. The blue dots, it represent the sites that have material structures. So what the archaeological, not only the excavation, but also the archaeological surveys shown that this is not only a material site, and is more complex than only an immaterial temple of Maronage or slavery resistance. It is linked with a complex colonial legacy. There were at least 2 colonial houses, Lenormand one and Lebrun the other, in the area. And as a map that you saw in the previous slide, the land was not empty. There is also a a cadastral system, so the land belonged to specific people. There was road. I didn't show to you, sorry, on the other side. And there is also a village. That is the actual site of Trouchenil. So is completely inserted in a complex colonial area. The Topol Plateau, that is the archaeology shows in a very well way, is not suitable for permanent living, but and also the things that I want to add, this great maturity of the site could be used for enhancing for the valorization of site. And so it's possible to go through this materiality to do more than the excavation of the cemetery. There are a lot of area to investigate in terms of materiality. These some grave goods that came from the 2010-2011 campaigns that show the complexity of this social group that are buried here. And for showing the complexity, I quoted some lines from Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, that is the Paul Virginie authors, when he described the house of the Messier Lenormand. Messier Lenormand lived 500 meters far from these sites, and this house is described by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre like a slave hut, where everyone lives together. There was one bed, and he and his wife, they slept together with the 10 slaves all time. So there was any distinction in terms of spaces between the owner, the landowner, and the slaves. For ending, the example of Trianon, and another example that Sasha introduced before, and here for showing how the archaeology clearly demonstrated that was the things that was listed as monument of of indentured laborers. So the living quarter, the barrack that you can see here, it is verification photos, are in fact not the living quarter for the general indentured laborers. Could be the living quarter of the cedars or other intermediary groups between the landlord and the immigrants, but are not indentured sign. I skip all the problem here, but with a proper archaeological excavation we can see a lot of interaction between this structure and the everyday life. For example, we had a lot of animal bones and also seeds that help us to describe the food and the everyday and the today life. Sorry. I skip. You say that we are running out of time.
We are running out.
Yeah. Okay, but it's really the last. In Trianon area, we have clue of the presence of the camp. So if you want to know how immigrants lived, we have to go to excavate this kind of site that of course are not listed. So for handling. For agenda, for archaeological agenda, we have of course to have a multidisciplinary approach and GIS and web-GIS approach that involve also the local communities. What sites? The living areas, of course. We have to stop to skip that part. It's hard to find them, but it's not impossible, as I showed in the slides before. We have to change the idea of archaeology of slavery and archaeology of indentured people with more detailed, more complex categories. So archaeology of free black people, Creole groups, diaspora policies, urban rescue policies, always the big cities that deserve a kind of studies like that. Coastal marine archaeology, but not only shipwrecks, also archaeology of tourism, for example, coastal landscape studies. How? Of course, we need a global approach on the scale of an Indian Ocean, with an ecological, environmental, but only to say that the archaeological approach could really readdress the materiality of the Mauritian heritage. And readdressing the materiality is a way also to skip the to skip the problem of social balancing and also to transform negative memories in memories, and also to define the site as they were and not following the political problem. Of course, the project Mauritius is young, so the site is not purified by the passing of time. So we can speak about the Dutch, for example, more easier than the French people. We can say that the Dutch, all Mauritians say that are the dodo eater, and you can use this dispredative way to define also the archaeological site, but we can say nothing about the policies that the French or the British people did with the slave and Indian immigrants. Of course, because it's very recent, memory. Also, the UNESCO paternalistic protection inscribing Apravasi at one side and Le Bon transformed on the other side didn't help to reach this social balance. So I restate, the awareness of the material heritage is truly the way to shift from an idea, a Western idea of heritage, to a more global idea of heritage, where the heritage is a place of cultural significance or cultural connection. Thank you, and sorry for that.